Welcome back to Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom. I'm Brendan Davis, your host, and this week's guest is Jonathan Garrison. Among his other career highlights, John was a vice president at Goldman Sachs for almost 10 years in both the U.S. and China, a former general manager of Dalian Wanda Group, an executive producer on the movie Southpaw, which starred Jake Gyllenhaal, and most recently, he is the founder and CEO of a new venture called En Route Media. John's story is very unique and seriously impressive. But what's maybe the most impressive thing to me here is how amazingly humble of a guy he is, considering all that he's accomplished. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this is probably the only interview I will ever do with someone who can just as easily and completely authoritatively discuss helping to spearhead Goldman Sachs' entry into China, the Dalian Wanda Group's splashy self-introduction to Hollywood for the launch of Qingdao Studios, and rocking the stage as frontman for his own punk rock band back in the day when you could still run into Henry Rollins out in the crowd or get pulled up on stage to belt out a song with somebody before tossing the mic and diving back into the mosh pit. This is a really good one and a lot of fun. Now, of course, I hope you listen to the whole interview, but moving forward, I'm taking a cue from my friend Fei Wu, and I'm now going to bullet point my show notes with a rough timecode reference so that you can skip back to the part that you're most interested in hearing again, ideally for that second time. However you listen to the show, though, I am glad that you do, and I hope that you enjoy. This episode of Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Stackry. Stackry is the global leader in international parcel forwarding from the U.S. to anywhere in the world. The way it works is that you shop at any U.S. retailer, you have your packages shipped to your Stackry address, and once everything has arrived, Stackry consolidates your stuff and ships it to you anywhere in the world, even China, saving you up to 80% of the shipping costs versus shipping things directly from the stores. Stackry provides free storage, same-day consolidation of your packages, and a tax-free U.S. address for you to use. This week's update is that I am now working to build my next Stackry shipment, so my story will continue. I need some things for summer from the U.S., and Stackry makes it easy and cost-effective for me to get them here in Beijing. Sign up today via the link in the show notes and use the offer code BIGFISH at the checkout to save 10% off your first shipment. And quickly, one last program note is that I have a special live episode dropping on Friday, China time, so that's 2 in 1 week. It is a special live episode from an event at the Entrepreneurs Organization. But now, please enjoy my interview with John Garrison. I am really happy to be sitting here today in the small studio at Bong Bong Pictures with Jonathan Garrison. John, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me over.
I'm really glad to have you here. And little backstory, we got acquainted in the small world Beijing stuff, as you do, through China Hollywood kind of stuff. And you have quite a career in that field, and I am but a supplicant. I am but an apprentice or a grasshopper compared to you, but not to embarrass you too much right out of the gate. But we actually connected over music, which was great. You know, so we'll end up talking about that a little bit. But before we get into the whole backstory, give me the short version of who you are, where you're from, and for you, why China? What sparked your interest? What brought you here in the first place?
Super. What brought me to this point, I'd say, was originally a study abroad. When I was in university, I was studying at the University of Utah, studying economics. Third year, a close friend of mine there had just encouraged me, if you're looking to study abroad anywhere, why don't you consider China? My parents and some family members had been over here in the late 80s, and so had lots of family memories and photos and things from that time. I came over for just expecting one semester. No Chinese language, I had studied some history and politics and things like that, but prior to coming over. But that was really an interesting, completely alien experience to step in. Can't read anything, can't really speak and converse. The one semester at Nanjing University was great. I made good friends, and I had great experiences, really good instructors, professors. And I noticed that right next to where I was staying was the Johns Hopkins program. That's the graduate school there. So I went back for my final year, tried to cram in a few Chinese courses and get ready to try to attend and apply to that program. I got in, so I was back the next year in the summer of '99. And kind of been back and forth to China ever since. I moved back here permanently. I left in 2001. I still remember at that time staying at the Kerry Center and looking out toward Third Ring Road, and there was no high-rise buildings and just different world back then. Came back in 2010 with Goldman Sachs. I'd been at Goldman for about 7-8 years before that, and was here with Goldman for a couple of years, and then moved over to a Chinese private enterprise, but large multinational, and we'll kind of get into some of those questions, I'm sure. But that's been something that kind of kept me around here for quite some time. With like a brief hiatus in 2016, I was back in the U.S. for about a year in L.A. and Park City, Utah, and then came back here again, working with the Wanda Group that I had been working with. Back with Wanda again, but a partner of mine and I back in the U.S., he's Chinese, in Salt Lake, we set up a little firm, and so it seemed like a pretty good kind of launch point late last year to step out and really focus on that full time.
And I know what you're doing is pretty interesting now. It's a very, very specific business, and we will definitely get to that. But I think it's interesting, will be interesting for people listening to think about if they don't know the entertainment industry, generally speaking, or more specifically that niche that you're sort of serving and relating to brands and everything. I think it's pretty great. So you grew up in Utah. It's a beautiful country. I've been through there a bit. I've had a few friends from there. What was it like as a kid for you? I mean, and how did China work its way? You mentioned that your parents had been over a bit. So what was it like growing up, and what did you see of China in kind of your life?
Very little we did live in Utah for a few years when I was younger. I don't recall a whole lot of like intersection with China other than Chinese restaurants. We moved to Boston when I was 12 or 13, and so I really grew up those formative years in Boston and that area. And it was from that kind of time that my parents had come over to China. Again, not an incredibly strong connection until I was in university, and then of course you come in contact with a lot of Chinese students, professors, whoever's working in the math department or some of those kind of sciences. You always get a lot of those kind of students. The University of Utah is a research institution, so we'd get quite a few Chinese scholars, and I would run into some of them from time to time. I was working at the university library in their computer lab, and I would have a couple of Chinese graduate students who would ask me to like polish resumes and cover letters and things like that. I could sort of pitch in, and in return they'd sort of give some insight about where might be interesting in China. And some of them we've kept in contact all these years later.
Wow. So did you? What was your original inclination towards your career path? Because I mean, you mentioned going to work for Goldman, et cetera. I mean, what were you? What was your path, and is that what you stuck to, or was that kind of a left or a right turn?
The China piece was not really like so much of a turn-off course. I was studying economics with sort of a focus on agricultural economics and what was happening in rural communities. When I came over, and actually one of the appeals of the Hopkins program was that if your language was of a certain level, you could design a course in the second half of the year. So you could kind of customize your curriculum. Not many students took advantage of that. I mean, that seemed like kind of a heavy lift to come in as a student and say, I'm going to put a course together in Chinese. I was pretty lucky, though. I had an instructor that had been over from the London School of Economics at the Hopkins program. He was Chinese, and so they let me work with him, but he was typically teaching the Chinese part of the program. That program's like about 50-50. We had roughly 100 students, 50 Chinese, 50 international. And so I was able to pick him up, and that helped because then I could converse in both English and Chinese with him pretty easily. And I studied like Chinese non-governmental agricultural associations. I just put together a course on something roughly in that kind of neighborhood. And I went out to Jiangsu and Zhejiang and sort of surrounding areas to visit a lot of like countryside, communities and see what was happening in terms of sharing market knowledge. And it was fascinating. I didn't really go down that path into, graduate school in agricultural economics, that kind of area. Partly because I stayed in China and worked, and I was working at an e-commerce company that was an early competitor to Alibaba. And so it was right at that early phase of a lot of the B2B kind of connectors in that e-commerce space. And our team, we traveled all over Eastern China, convincing, little motorcycle manufacturers and other people to sign up so they would be available to offshore offshore procurement, and people in the U.S. and other markets that were looking for parts and, intermediate goods coming out of China. Fun experience. After a while and working with a small management consulting team, I went back to the U.S. and I actually got a job with Formosa Plastics Group doing production planning. And so I always recommend that if you're coming out of, just out of your education and maybe your first job or two, if you have some opportunity to get sales experience or operations experience, those are both going to be valuable no matter what you do. So I was there for a couple of years until reconnected with some people that I'd worked with at Goldman as an intern way back in a summer. I went to New York for the summer and worked at Goldman for a summer. And they were opening an office in Salt Lake City. I had family that had still kind of gone out that way, and I had gone to the University of Utah. So I joined when they had like 100 people in the office. I think it's now like 2,500 or something. It's one of their bigger U.S. offices.
You mentioned you interned for Goldman. What was kind of the focus, or did they kind of just, at the time, did they kind of throw you in? I mean, how did it work?
Yeah, when I interned, it was just, that was just I was out in New York for the summer. My sister lived in town. I kind of wanted to just be in the city. It was a great experience.
Sure. Doesn't take a lot of convincing, probably, to
No.
That's a fun gig.
So it was just an odd bunch of like summer assignments in their old 85 Broad, which was downtown, their old headquarter building. So on going back to Salt Lake ultimately with them, it was kind of nice. I had some connections across the firm. But at that time that I was interning, I think they had like 8,000 employees globally. When I joined in 2003, there were probably 25,000 and continuing to grow.
And if I'm skipping anything, let me know where we can come back. Sure. But I guess to follow that thread, so what did you join Goldman? Like what kind of position, and like what was your area of focus with that?
I was in the investment management division when I really went back on like full time. And so investment management, and my team that I was running ultimately picked up a lot of interesting projects. Like they rolled out a private bank in Salt Lake City using kind of their industrial bank registration rules there. Not super interesting stuff probably for this audience, but we were given the opportunity to design all the products, test all the products, work with the sales teams that would be, pitching the product. How does it actually work? What does it do? Everything from maritime lending products to high net worth sort of home lending kind of things, deposits and other less exciting banking products.
Well, you mentioned but there's China in between there. Did we skip over a chunk of a professional China time?
Not really. So it was like graduate school, and then the work where I moved to Shanghai, and I worked Nanjing and Shanghai for about another year plus, and then came back to the U.S. with the Formosa Plastics Group, and then that Taiwanese company was actually in South Carolina. Huge manufacturing location down there. Right. And then to Goldman. And while at Goldman, I also eventually took on some roles with the Hong Kong and Singapore offices, where I was dealing with sales teams out of those offices, and we'd moved a number of their functions back over to the U.S. just because we were kind of closer to the technology and finance teams. So I remained connected, and ultimately they knew within Goldman that I speak Chinese, and have experience in China, have some network in China, and as the Beijing office was opening up, they were looking for people that had kind of years of Goldman culture and
right, because it takes a while to be part of their world, and then plus the China thing is not something that just anyone has.
Yeah, and they'd hired so many people locally here that I think they found that the culture in the office here was kind of getting away from them. And so they'd hired, it was one of their very early people to kind of come over in that sort of capacity. And I ran a couple of teams in private wealth management and compliance and regulatory reporting kind of things. So things that we just needed people to fill those roles. I understood them and had to get my securities license here in China in Chinese, which is
that had to be again, it's this podcast doesn't fit into any one narrow bubble. There are people who would slap me for moving on from that. What was that like?
That's like reading you read a 400, 500 page book, and if you've ever gone through a Chinese exam, like it's It's very much memorization of the material as it's written.
Wow.
And some slight variation. They play a lot of tricks with just like, a little reformulation
Try
of
to trip you
one
up.
sentence, and you can easily miss out on that. You have to score 60 points to pass. And I had taken it a couple of times where I scored 59.5, and I thought,
Oh, no.
just round up, guys. They're like, no, it just
please.
doesn't
work like
cut
that.
it, so you got to wait another couple of months. The test will be different every time it comes out. And it's really not the subject matter that's hard. It's 160 questions in 110 minutes. So you have to be able to read
You have to
Chinese
fly
fast.
through it. Yeah.
Yeah, and each of these questions are fairly substantial with, text and then analysis of the answers and select and move on. So they were always sort of surprised to see, a white guy walk in and sit down in the exam room. I never saw anyone else like me in those settings.
I can't imagine so. I mean, really, even today, I'm sure it would be pretty rare.
Yeah, so I had gotten my licensing. It was over at Goldman and the finance district for about 2.5 years. And right about that time, just playing golf one day in Shawnee, a guy in my group said, there's a Chinese company that's beginning to really go abroad, has some real ambitions to expand internationally. They're the Wanda Group. They just built the Changbaishan ski resort up on the border of North Korea. They're doing a lot of interesting things in cultural industries. So entertainment, travel, tourism, sports eventually. They're looking for people like me, is what he had mentioned. And I went over for a couple of interviews that I wasn't convinced went all that well, but I got some really immediate feedback from their HR. I think I understand like what their motivations were at that time. They really had to fill those positions. They just couldn't find anybody. But it was a pretty good fit for me. I was willing to go and, have the experience. It's not always like the easiest transition to come from like, a company with like 100 years of corporate culture and sort of those kinds of values and like a Goldman, and then into a Chinese company that's been on a trajectory of like rapid growth for like 20 years. They've almost never really dealt with a downturn in their time. And so that really permeates their culture.
I can imagine how they plan and how they handle setbacks, things like that. I imagine there's not the perspective to think, well, this is cyclical or this will rebound.
Exactly. The perspective is probably the perfect word for it. That's just not really ingrained there. The feeling that, look, we are a group that just accomplishes whatever we set out to do, which in the backdrop of like what was happening in real estate growth and prices, even in the the last 10 years. When I joined Wanda, I think maybe even going back 8 years prior to when I joined, it really wasn't that big of an operation. And during the time I was there, it's probably like doubled from that time, late 2012 until now, and not counting their international expansion, but just their footprint here within China.
And so, to be clear, you were doing finance stuff specifically, or had you segged into entertainment at that point?
Well, they'd put together a team doing international investments, basically, and hired a number of guys as we kind of sorted out with our different skill sets. There were some guys working on international real estate, so they focused on what Wanda was doing in London and Chicago and Australia, Los Angeles, ultimately. Another guy or two, a small team that ended up really focusing on bigger ticket M&A items. So they would work on maybe one discrete project in a year. My boss approached me and said, we bought AMC movie theaters. We're starting to get into this, like, not only cinema, but other entertainment space. And Qingdao, originally that was a project with the big studio project in Qingdao, that they were still sort of finalizing the final destination for that. They hadn't
picked the spot.
Qingdao yet. But it was a priority for Wang Jianlin, the chairman at Wanda, to have more relationships with people in the industry globally, Hollywood being a big part of that. Nobody was really forthcoming in that group to like raise their hand and say, I'll take this on. It looked interesting to me, and there was some real things to deliver there. So I basically raised my hand and said, let my team take on that kind of stuff. And so that was everything from really anything somewhat cultural industries and entertainment related.
Well, sure. I mean, please, as much as you're comfortable or care to, I mean, I'd love to hear some of the examples. I mean, I know some of this, but I think people would enjoy hearing some of the things, because what people who don't even follow China might be familiar, like, for instance, with Southpaw, things like that. So if you could talk about a few of the things that you did during your time there, that'd be great.
Yeah, really any kind of opportunity that was in that space. And so the immediate priorities were, let's get some relationships on paper. And often, for a Chinese company, that means let's sign non-binding LOIs or MOUs or things like that sort of build up the dossier of, like, these are our friends, these are people that are willing to be in business with us.
This is their stack of worthless paper.
Yeah, it's valuable to them because
right.
it's a message to their government
right.
partners and their financing partners. Others.
I had my Hollywood hat on, sorry.
Yeah, they may show those guys, and it's hard for people offshore, I think, to always, when I say offshore, outside of China, to understand what their motivations are going to be. That. And it's
what is the value of that? I'm stepping on you. Let me hear you say it cleanly.
Well, I think it's not the nature of a Chinese company to divulge a lot of that, but it is valuable for them to go to the government and say, as we're pitching for, an impressive project here, and we've got, here's the overall blueprint and everything that's going to go into it. Governments have gotten more sophisticated about, like, your ability to really execute this vision, and
right.
and without showing that you have much resources available, without many resources that you're sort of already engaged with, they are probably unlikely to buy your whole story.
Right.
You're seeing that now with, like, a lot of what's happening in theme parks, where theme parks obviously was something that Wanda was also very active in right at that time when I joined, and I spent about nearly 3 years there at that time with Wanda. But yeah, the government's looking at, we will approve projects that have other commercial real estate elements to them, but if the theme park is the priority, we really need you to build that first and commit to that one core asset. That's kind of what they're after, is more culture or things that are going to be tourism related that will draw in that sort of foot traffic that aren't just a pure...
Don't use it as like a shiny sales piece to get a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, they're not just a pure real estate play. Like, the developers really want to just build houses and commercial real estate malls and office space, things like that they know how to sell. They've got an organization to really market that stuff.
Higher profit per square foot, probably, things like that. And you got to operate a theme park.
So it's an interesting dilemma. I mean, as the narrative and what was sort of allowable for developers in China began to change, they didn't necessarily change their expertise and their DNA. This is what they were good at, was developing the core product of hotels and apartments and other commercial space, and less good at, like, well, how do we run a film studio, or how do we operate theme parks, or big show, live theater and live performance complexes and things like that. Those are trickier pieces, though they did help these companies, and Wanda being one of them, successfully win big projects they were able to develop. Like, in my group, we had a lot of other things come in. I mean, anything that was interesting in that cultural industry space, because we weren't real estate, and really at that time, that company was commercial real estate and culture industries. And they had Wanda Cinemas, which was growing here. They had the International with AMC theaters. And so deals with other film technology related companies, a lot of different production companies and people from Hollywood that had sort of proposals to get in business in China would come through our office. And so it's a bit of discovery, like, what does the company and what does, Mr. Wong at Wanda really want to do with any of these parties? Discussions with, most of the big studios, and obviously had people come out to some events in Qingdao to sort of check it out and start to build a relationship with Wanda to see at least where that would go. So I had picked up a deal with one of the major studios. We were talking about some slate finance, and I don't know that it was something that they understood entirely, and I think made people at high up at Wanda in the culture group and at the very top a little bit nervous about that level of commitment just right out of the gate. probably indicative is that, there was a big event in 2013 in September.
Like
where
the kickoff event?
Yeah, the big groundbreaking.
Giant red
ceremony.
carpet, all these Hollywood stars, and made quite a splash to kind of launch the thing.
Yeah, so that was
in Qingdao.
That was an assignment that came to my door. I got a knock on the door one day that, hey, we're doing this. We've been talking about it for a while, but it's happening in like 9 weeks, and it's going to be in Qingdao. Can you go get people from the studios?
Oh, so you put that together?
Yeah, from the talent agencies,
Okay.
all the talent. And so I took one of my team members over. We spent about 6 weeks total in LA. It was an interesting challenge for us. The company had bought a theater chain, which was a little bit different than being like right in the heart of the industry. And so we had a little bit of credibility to kind of work out with people. But
Sure.
We had a reasonable budget approved to really make this happen. What we found and sort of understood right away from my team was that there's a whole sort of program around this that involves transportation and visa processing and security.
Just the logistics is that's half the production at least.
Yeah,
showing up on the red carpet and looking good is 5% of it probably.
Yeah, and we know how at that time, I think institutionally, the company knew how to do maybe one of the big thing. Let's go get a movie star, get them, under some kind of agreement. There's always going to be things about image usage and what we're actually asking them to do and when we need them there, and signing basically like an appearance agreement. That kind of thing they could manage. It's all of the other sort of smaller ancillary things that if we're asking back through the organization, their inclination is going to be, well, why don't we use our own resources for this? And they just weren't equipped to handle high touch.
It's just not an option.
Clients offshore, from picking up their visa, their passports and things, sensitive documents and things like that, to then getting hair and makeup people on board and over.
Approved people who also themselves are, there's for the sake, I'm saying this for the sake of people who don't know, but there's whatever, like even a top quality, say, makeup artist would get. And then there's someone who is within a certain star's contract or is on their approved list. And so to be approved by that client, that celebrity, and then their rate is, 5 times what the other person might be, for instance. And they're traveling like you might think that star travels. They're traveling first class.
Yeah.
Internationally. Right.
Yeah,
so it's a whole other ball game when you're dealing with that level of the industry.
We quickly budgeted all that out, built in plenty of buffer, because we realized the important thing was the deliverable on this. It was not going to be such an enormous expense for Wanda as a whole, given how important this whole big development was to the chairman. We could be pretty generous and just for the sake of time, let's just get this done. We're not going to squabble over, every piece of it. We certainly, I think, then the organization was criticized in the market at times. Like, this is they're overly generous. This isn't great for China. That really wasn't our problem. We had a very limited timeline, and
I was going to say that's not a lot of time to pull off something that complex.
Yeah, so when we started getting, I remember as we got Catherine Zeta-Jones and John Travolta saying, yeah, we're on board very quickly, it's started to pick up momentum until the point we had Nicole Kidman and Christoph Waltz. We had Ewan McGregor come over, Kate Beckinsale. And we got a call from some of Leonardo DiCaprio's people, and said, we'd heard something about this and he'd be interested to come over. And it wasn't something we could just shoot down, even though we were pressed for time. We were in the last couple of weeks prep. And so it was a quick report back up and we got a green light, and that helped. I think it kind of changed the whole dimension of what they were trying to do out there.
Right.
It was a fun experience for our group. It's not like the core sort of professional direction that myself or any of my team wanted to be. We don't want to be professional talent wranglers.
Well, but it is actually it's a complex international production, and as you said, high touch people, a lot of moving parts. It's a complex production to pull together on a short time frame.
Yeah.
And so who else is going to do it? You don't throw the interns at this.
No, and you also you always have to think in China that in these kinds of events, the government's really the most important audience
exactly.
for a company.
You
here.
can't screw this up, basically.
Yeah, and when you're dealing with them, you're going to get a variety of different opinions, and you're going to have curveballs at the last moment. You're going to have even coming down to like picking locations for where things are going to happen and are going to be negotiated at the very last minute. The negotiations with government entities seem to like never really be final.
I've noticed that.
Yeah. Until you like show up and this is happening here at this time. So that's just a challenge. We could try to insulate in interacting with like international parties through my team. We eventually became called the International Strategic Cooperation Department. So we were doing smaller scale and sort of one-off type of investments in culture industries primarily. And then also these kinds of other things like partnerships and engagements. We had made a trip to LA, and right prior to that event in Qingdao had finalized a donation to the Academy Museum in Los Angeles. And that was something that they wanted to do. There wasn't really much of a Chinese presence in their whole donor base. And so they made a good case, and the chairman was very generous and wrote a check for...
That made a big impression?
Yeah, it was kind of a big win for them. It was probably
bigger
than they expected.
Yeah, that was positive. That was a win.
Yeah, and so that was stuff like that would come to my desk. Like, let's go figure that out and make that happen.
Right.
But we were looking at assets from like theme parks and obviously in film and television kind of area. Ultimately, even financial institutions and other odd things would come through my office. As I mentioned, like the engagement with Hollywood, I think the appetite at a place like Wanda was more like, let's do one or two things and just have an experience and get into this, like learn the workflow of the whole thing. Let's have a bit of a playbook.
Yeah, and you got a project off during that
time
frame.
So one of the companies that had come out to Qingdao, I think most of them were invited to come back with some projects that they could work on with Wanda. I kind of understand that can be a little bit challenging for the bigger studios, especially if they're trying to package up a full slate of pictures, to pick out a project or two to allow some entity somewhere to cherry pick.
And they have a sense of what's valuable to your side. So it has to work for them. There has to be some reason, some compelling reason to go halfway around the world and do it, et cetera.
Yeah, and really what they were looking at ultimately was, let's just do one picture. We don't even care necessarily, or at least there wasn't direction that this needs to be done in China or with Chinese elements or anything. We later did get a bit of that feedback, but it was after the Weinstein Company had brought in a couple of pictures, and one of those ultimately went through and was greenlit and financed in kind of a unique way with the Wanda Group and the Weinstein Company, but really production finance getting put up by Wanda. And so that was a deal that came back in through my office, and the Motion Pictures Group at Wanda, the Wanda Pictures, had agreed to go ahead and proceed with it on a condition that I would stay involved and kind of lead the deal side of things. So that was a good experience to go through the whole financing and distribution and all the other...
In which picture? I'm not sure.
And that was Southpaw with Antoine Fuqua directing, Jake Gyllenhaal, right. Rachel McAdams. And so, an interesting experience for them to go through. As any company that's gone through, a film finance and distribution experience with any party in Hollywood, they're not without their challenges.
Sure.
Along the way. I left the Wanda Group before the picture was released, and so it wasn't really into its revenue phase at that point. But we had at least a picture that was delivered, and it was getting ready to come out. I had left in April. I think the film came out in July.
And so you left them with a template for how, this is how this works. And so they've been through that process kind of front to back.
I think it probably would take more than one project to have that really not locked down. But
you need those first footprints in the snow to know which way the story is.
And so much of that deal and communication was happening in English as well. It's harder for a Chinese company to absorb all of that. I mean, they would have, had they done this same thing in a real estate play of some kind and it was all in Chinese with Chinese parties, they would capture a lot more of that knowledge better. But it will take them some more time, I'm sure.
So when you left Wanda, why was that? Where did you go to next?
Well, it was good to just get home to the United States for a little while and spend time with family, be away from, I'd been in Beijing for like 6 years, pretty much nonstop at that time, and wanted a little bit of a break and take a look at some different perspective. Before coming back to China last year, so I left in mid-2015. I came back 2 years later. There was a brief period of time where I was running the Park City Film Studio at the behest of their founder and shareholder. So that was an interesting period. It was a challenging proposition, a brand new 3 soundstage facility, 45,000 feet of square feet of production space up there, and a good core team to it. Location, incentives, a number of those things, those are challenges for lots of production areas in the region. And, and there's New Mexico that's fairly well established.
Exactly.
Just down, south. There are other options and competition for space. You even see in California, so much of the space that was previously not and kind of underutilized now is full. So that was interesting. I had been through the sort of the setup, the operations, the research, the sort of the value proposition of a studio, because early on in the time of Qingdao coming online, there wasn't really a team around that, and almost anything related to that area, Qingdao and the studio was coming through my department for quite some time, including working with any kind of international advisors or consultants. And so I'd been through at least all of that and seen, what research and things were meaningful to a location. I think some of that translated for Park City at the time. But luckily, in that meantime, a former colleague of mine at Goldman, a Chinese guy, Jinhua Ho, Jinhua had called me up and said, look, we have an opportunity to do some business in China in the in-flight entertainment space. This is something that kind of crossed my path a couple of years before, and this was going to turn out to be like a real catalyst for a new career direction.
And I know that's what you're primarily focusing on right now, and something that you mentioned. I mean, we've spoken a little bit about this, but I did not realize until we kind of started the intro of this that so your Chinese business partner is in Salt Lake, and then you're the Laowai who's here in China. So that's kind of an unusual role reversal. Sounds like there's a Disney comedy in here.
It works really well for us because I think for me on this side, I'm visible as a non-Chinese person with connections and opportunities back to international markets.
Right.
But as people get to know us, they find that we're also like very, very flexible and adept within this local market. It's also nice that Jin's back in Salt Lake, and Salt Lake is an area where I like to go back to as a bit of a base, great nature and outdoors and environment. Interesting sort of sporting and outdoor culture, which I think are things that we'll see are areas for growth in China. And it's also not so mature and crowded. I mean, it's a smaller city.
Sure.
So there are sort of unique opportunities that will pop up for us there where we can be helpful for local companies in Salt Lake or companies from China that are looking at kind of a specific market. And that's a market that we're really well connected in.
Well, that's great that is he settled there, or is he?
He is. He actually worked at Goldman in the Salt Lake office. I had hired him in that office. He went to his MBA there at Westminster College, so he's had some roots there for a number of years.
Excellent. And so what is it primarily, I mean, in-flight entertainment, people think of it as, the movie's on the plane, but it is, but it's a lot more than that. What's kind of your role with this new company?
Well, our new company, En route Global, we are, I would say, a sales and advisory organization. We have a couple of lines of business that are really more sales focused. It started off with, and the reason for the name En route, that being sort of an idea of being in motion, being on the way to some destination. He had called me and just said, company in Chongqing is rolling out this new platform. It's sort of tablet based at the outset, and eventually they have strategy for being the sort of well-positioned platform for when Wi-Fi rolls out on domestic flights in China. So the founder's a good friend of ours. He builds the tablets. He deals with the content on the tablets, so rights and sort of the design of the whole interface, which includes, as you mentioned, like movies, television, games, music, what you normally see. Also kind of an excursions segment, which is an opportunity, like if you're on there, to sort of look at other global destinations and domestic destinations in China. And we sort of picked up that piece at the request of our friends in Chongqing. They said, look, we're really a technology company, and so we're focused on our stack and on our hardened software, our airline relations and content. What we're not as adept at or as committed to is that monetization piece of it. We know that it exists, but we kind of need some help in that area. Would you guys pick up the ad sales piece of that? And so look, that's a product that's already in existence. There's a big audience. We don't have to build anything. We don't have to go raise money to support this. We can kind of bootstrap a business around this. And so we started off with that focus. And then we also do focus on those kind of excursion destinations. So we'll have like tourism offices from various states and countries that we talk to about putting together like an e-magazine and putting it on the tablet. And our feedback on that has been really good from the people who have put those destinations that have put content on the tablet. So it's a pretty well-curated audience that's in the in-flight space in China. You know their demographics. You have great data on them. And this is a digital channel to advertise in-flight, which has been missing in the domestic fleet in China pretty much forever.
Exactly. I mean, and people, whenever friends come here for the first time from international destinations, I couldn't use my phone in airplane mode. They told me no, and of course that's changing now.
Yeah.
But it's been such a revelation. Even the flights I've taken, some flights that do have decent entertainment in flight, depending on the airline and the cabin you're in and all that.
Yeah.
But in just the typical coach experience has really been fairly miserable. If you're flying a China branded carrier, sorry to say.
Yeah, and there's
not the service. The folks work really hard, but just entertainment. There's entertainment, and you can't use any of your devices in Wi-Fi mode or anything like that.
Yeah, that's been lagging, and that will change. I suspect it's like a 5-year window over which Wi-Fi will become more available in flight. But it was interesting because that was just sort of a catalyst. That was just a point around which my partner and I could say, let's get started doing something outside of what we've been doing. He had been at Goldman still and left. I had been at Goldman and then Wanda. And wanting to be in a little bit more charge of our own destinies, this was a good sort of focal point for us. And it turned out that, that company even in Chongqing had approached us with, help on their Series B. And that's an area where we can be really helpful. Like we both have that kind of finance background. In my time at Goldman, I'd taken some time as well to do my MBA. I went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. So we've had background of doing that kind of financial planning and advisory type of work.
Right.
So working with them on their Series B was a good opportunity to kind of pick up that piece of the business. And we really looked at the in-flight entertainment piece as well. Like, it's not really our aspiration to be ad sales people. There's a whole segment of people that do that.
Sure.
And cracking that into that sphere, it felt a little bit like my first forays into entertainment, but without like the backing of a big conglomerate that was buying cinemas and things like that. But we like it because the relationships that it generates for us with either brands or destinations, we're really kind of active in that travel and tourism space as a result. And we like it because we want it to be successful for our partner in Chongqing. It's obviously a much better experience to have the in-flight entertainment. And if you've been on a flight where they've handed out a little iPad-type tablet and you've got newer movies and television and things to enjoy, like that's better than staring at the magazine or whatever was available previously. So that's kind of our motivation. But it's just sort of snowballed into new opportunities that continue to pop up, and areas where we'll look at, like, is this an industry that we have really much knowledge of? Like, how does it operate? And do we have many connections and resources that we could draw on for it to be meaningful, whether it's here in China or it's offshore? So we get all kinds of interesting requests about, can we help raise money here? Can we help advise on something there? Sometimes even companies that are looking to go public, and we're not an investment bank or a broker-dealer, but we know that process, and we also know the pieces that they'll need to put together to make it successful. And so in that case, we might pick up some of that work.
Well, that's what as we sort of go into the home stretch here, I'm curious about, and again, from knowing you a little bit and having discussed this, knowing that, again, dealing with investment, finance-related issues is obviously a big part of your wheelhouse, and as I learned that you have the securities license here in China, et cetera, that's a really unique skill set. And what do you see, just whether it's that or whether it takes a left turn, but what do you see as sort of your natural evolution over the next, let's just say 5-ish years or so, both professionally and personally? I mean, you're very invested in China. Do you see China being an even longer-term proposition for you, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's going to be inextricable from our company. So we do have an entity in Utah in the United States. We've got an entity in Hong Kong, and then our Shenzhen company that's being opened now, which is a WOFE.
So you're kind of tied together by contracts as a company, quote unquote.
Yeah, and through shareholder agreements and things. So it's really just my partner and I driving it. I think we see the next, say, 3 years would be a safe kind of projection period for us to build up some of our sales capability and management capability in things like the in-flight entertainment space is not going to go away for us. We'll have some commitment to that, and whether it's our own time as it is right now, or we've got people on who are dealing with data, pricing, and inventory. And that's more of our function in this. We'll connect agencies and parties that have the brand relationships already. This is a new conduit for them. We'll sort of basically make sure that they have the right customer experience, they get the right value out of it for their clients, and that they've got pretty transparent and consistent pricing, because we'll be the touch point with the company. So we see that as something that's going to continue. We signed a contract with a company called Nihao Pay, which is an offshore vendor that they're approved to settle Chinese yuan transactions offshore. And so they work really as a conduit for Alipay, WeChat Pay, and Union Pay outside of China. And so if you're a Chinese traveler going abroad and you're either online or offline, so I imagine you're at a ski resort buying a ticket and you see that there's an option to use WeChat Pay. So you use WePay or Alipay or something to just draw your bank account back in China. You're not then worried about whether you're carrying enough cash or you have credit card balance that's sufficient for all of your travel needs. So it's an interesting opportunity that's popped up. We've already begun. We just barely started. We've already begun signing up a number of clients, a lot of them in the tourism space.
Sure.
We look that's where we're most familiar and connected, and we know that story.
You're kind of building that corridor out, and then it'll probably branch out from there.
Yeah, we know that story of, like, here's what's happening in outbound travel, here's what's happening in spend in outbound travel, roughly where a lot of that is happening, and so we can kind of target. Besides that, for other reasons, we're at a lot of travel conferences and things like that. So that's an entity and sort of a sub-function of our company that we'll need to focus some support on to really build out a sales and support team. But that's kind of our direction. I think on the more advisory, finance-related things, it's going to be hard for my partner and I to be completely replaced out of that. It's such a relationship-driven kind of thing. But let's continue to build the organization and stay active in those few spaces. And then we'll see what happens. You never know what's going to pop up when you're working in China.
That's true. And so you plan to this really is a home for you.
Yeah, for now. I think I mean preferably we're at the point here in, I would say, the next 12 to 18 months where it doesn't really matter where we're operating. We can come in. I think we do need to have put the time in, but we've done that. We do actually spend a lot of time here. I'm in Beijing most of the time, and then down in Shenzhen, probably the remainder of that. My partner, Jin, is from Guangxi, which is a really interesting connection for us because Guangxi, I would think, is a little bit like the Salt Lake area for us, where it's not as concentrated with sort of like foreign-related opportunities. And so it's great for us to go down and open up doors there. We find people that just really lack the resource to be connected to international markets or opportunities.
Very nice. And so before we go, I have to ask you about two other things that are a little slightly less serious, although they're very serious to you.
Sure.
Tell me briefly about your adventures in Chinese cuisine, and what is your music background? Because we kind of blew right past that. I meant to ask you that early, but we'll tag it in here towards the end.
We got to talk music at the end.
We do.
Cuisine, like I'm really not a great chef. My brother is a chef. He actually runs like all the food and everything food related for a group in Utah that handle the Real Salt Lake Soccer Club and all their affiliates. And so he's really the magician in that side. I do like to experiment. It's fun to get home and try out a new dish. Lately, I pick up the app All Recipes, give a shout out to them because they're great. And a lot of it's just like American-style Chinese food.
I've been seeing your photos on WeChat, guys. I always ask the guests for some photos, and I'm going to get a few pictures of some of your dishes. I swear these could be on a restaurant menu. I haven't tasted them, but they look great.
I mean, they're surprising in their in their complexity, but also just how quickly you can get them together. And I just do it right by the book. I don't have sort of the creative bent yet.
You're not trying to improvise. You're not trying to get all Bourdain on this.
Yeah. That and Cambodian food. I've been that was one of the English language books I found at page one that was anything to do with Cambodia or Southeast Asian cuisine. And so tried a bunch of interesting recipes out of Cambodia.
Nice. Well, in the music thing, what's your background in music or interest in music here?
Well, I remember when I was a kid asking my brother like the question, what is rock and roll? This is like genius, right? When you're a little kid and you're just starting to get sort of some idea. He's like, well, like Neil Diamond, like that.
My gosh!
Obviously, he didn't know either. Though, not to knock Neil Diamond. We grew up listening to Neil Diamond, but
no, he's great, but he's not rock.
He's not. Yeah, so I had some learning to do. But I remember when a friend. He had just got a skateboard, and he also had a couple of older friends in the neighborhood. And he's like, "You've got to hear this new album." And he made me a tape copy, a little cassette tape, and it was Nevermind the Bollocks, the Sex Pistols. And so that's always like really a revelation the first time you hear Anarchy in the UK or something like that. And so we had moved to Boston. I was pretty young, and I started going to the all ages shows like every weekend, every Saturday. There'd be like five bands for $4 or those kind of things. And so I saw like everybody that was playing in Boston.
Just rattle off a bunch of names. I've got a bunch of music friends listening to this show.
Government Issue, Dag Nasty, all the DC related bands. It was after the Misfits. This is probably mid 80s, 84, 85.
Well, like Scream was kicking around then, or
Scream came and played. Void. Who else? Like a lot of the New York guys who came a couple years later, like Youth of Today and that whole kind of that latter straight edge movement. Cro-Mags, Agnostic Front. Saw Agnostic Front many times. It was always a very tough show. But I'd go see the metal shows when I could too. Great Slayer shows, Overkill. Always the smaller kind of stuff. I remember hanging out at Newbury Comics one day, look over we had a little band called DTX, Downtown Crossing, and I was the vocalist, and my best friend was our guitar player, really talented, artistic guy. We look over, and I'm like, it's that guy over there with the bars tattoo on his neck.
What?
That's Henry.
Is that Henry?
And so we go over and we're like,
Henry Rollins?
We're like, Henry Rollins, like, what are you doing in town? He was in town to watch Kiss.
That's Henry Rollins.
What you're gonna hear from Henry?
His from if you listen to his, you hear him or read his interviews. His breadth of love for music, there's no bounds.
Yeah,
he'll drop a bluegrass thing that like these guys this is the best thing ever, and here's why.
Yeah, well, my very first show was the Circle Jerks. And so, Keith Morris up on stage singing Nervous Breakdown, which he wrote and was, one of the Black Flag early flagship songs.
Yeah.
And Slapshot played like every other weekend, Wrecking Crew, a lot of the local bands from Boston. Lemonheads were playing quite a bit.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of great music coming through town. I remember the very first time Bad Religion made a West Coast tour. This was probably 87. And I knew the lyrics to almost every song that they had come out with. They only had a few albums. I think Suffer had just barely come out. And this tiny little club with like a knee-high stage. And at one point, Greg Graffin reaches down and just pulls me up on stage and hands me the mic to sing The Voice of God is Government with him. And I'm like, the one song I don't know.
Oh,
like,
no
all the
way.
lyrics. So I just kind of like muffled,
Did you know enough of it to...
through. I kind of got through it, and then we
man.
could hit the chorus. And I'm like, my only saving grace is just to toss the mic and dive back into the crowd. But I thought that was kind of the high point of my life, perhaps, at that point. But
Well, I think there are very
funny.
few. Not very many people, frankly, are like an exec from, say, Goldman and like Wanda, and then like we're singing in punk bands and stage diving, and then this is all integrated into one cool
punched
dude.
in the eye at a Pantera concert, and saw Soundgarden open for Danzig way back in the early Louder Than Love tour.
Yeah,
and
that was an awesome tour. I saw those guys on that tour also.
I remember seeing Social Distortion play like a little acoustic set also in a comics and record shop in Boston, and they just rattled on their like guitar cases and stuff, and it was the Prison Bound, that whole tour. So even before their big self-titled album that kind of made them again really blow up. But a lot of cool bands, and it was always just at that age it's as social as it is about just the music. That's what you talk about with your friends. Your life is a little like High Fidelity with John Cusack, where you've all got your top 5 favorite songs for this situation, that situation, and mixing up tapes to take out to the half pipe that we'd built out in the woods and skate all day during the summer months in Boston.
Nice. Well, I don't think I'm going to let you leave China until we form a band. even we got to play one show, man.
Nice.
Awesome.
I love there was a metal club across town in Haidian, and it's so fun to go watch that in China. And it's fun. Like, I mean, I'm not going to jump into the mosh pit at this age or anything, but it's just kind of fun to watch the dynamics. You see some of the bands up there, and there's like that one guy in the band that he's like the heart and soul of it.
Exactly.
The rest of the other guys are kind of like, they're there because he's sort of drugged them along, but he's like so into it, and just watching that kind of passion for it, which is
it's inspiring. I've seen
fairly
some
low
really
reward.
I've seen a few. I haven't seen anything recently, but there's some dedicated rock, punk, pop people. There's some really great energy out there.
Yeah.
And it's really special when you run across it.
Yeah.
John, thanks so much, man.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, that's the show this week. I hope that you enjoyed it. Don't forget to find out more about John or any of the things we talked about. You can check out the blog post at crazyinagoodway.com. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next week.